The Blanke and Metzinger article is a little complicated, but it's worth a careful reading to better understand the phenomenal self model. Metzinger is the prime advocate of the phenomenal self model. And in this article, he talks about the minimal phenomenal self, which is a central component of the phenomenal self model, and shows how it functions in terms of explaining out-of-body experiences and a wide, weird variety of out-of-body experiences. So the minimal phenomenal self is composed of 3 necessary and sufficient conditions, and they explain that if all 3 are there, then you definitely have a minimal phenomenal self, and all of them are necessary. So you have to have them all, and if you have the 3, then you have a minimal phenomenal self. And the 3 are, first, a global ownership of your body, a sense of mindness, and they also talk about this as a self-identification. That is, you take this body, this experience of the body, as your own. And then second, you have a spatiotemporal self-location, and this is your volume of your body, your position and time, that you're here and now. That is what constitutes your spatiotemporal self-location. And the third component is a weak first-person perspective, 1PP abbreviated. And this is a geometrical egocentric model of the body in the world. And you can think of this weak first-person perspective as a point of view. This is you in space, the view in which you are looking at the world. How you are how is your perceptions in relation to your geometric space. So different from the spatiotemporal self-location that gives you a sense of how much space you take up in the world, and that you're here and now. The geometric egocentric model of the body is putting you, where you are in relation to the world. So I am seeing this part of the room, I'm not seeing that part of the room, this is to my right, this is to my left. That's what the weak first-person perspective is doing. And this weak first-person perspective is transparent. And what that means is that you don't look at this model, so this is a self-model, but you don't understand that it's a model. You are using the model in the world, and that's what it is for the model to be transparent. So we're talking about representations, so you're having a representation of yourself in the world, but that representation is transparent. You use it in order to represent things in the world. So what you're seeing is the world, but you're seeing it from a particular perspective and from a particular time. So we are not conscious of our minimal phenomenal self. We're conscious of the world by using our minimal phenomenal self. When we become conscious of the model, then we develop a strong first-person perspective. And Metzinger describes the strong first-person perspective as, in this quote, a strong first-person perspective is exactly what makes consciousness subjective. The fact that a system represents itself not only as a self, but also as a self in the act of knowing, in the act of representing yourself as a self, so you know that you're a self. This means that the organism represents itself as representing in real time. It co-represents the representational relation during the ongoing process of representation. A phenomenal self as subject appears exactly when the organism possesses a phenomenal model of the intentionality relation. So it's when you recognize that you're representing. Intentionality here, we talked about with Searle, just means representing. So I'm representing that it's a representation. So this is a higher order. Strong first-person perspective is a higher order sort of representation of your consciousness. So the minimal phenomenal self is conscious. If you've got those 3 components, you are conscious. You are a conscious self in the world, but Metzinger calls the strong first-person perspective subjectivity, and he says that requires this higher order sense of yourself. All right, so Nagel talked about subjectivity, and some people talk about subjectivity and associate that with consciousness, that consciousness is subjective experience, phenomenal consciousness is subjective experience. Other people, like Metzinger, associate subjectivity with this higher order kind of consciousness. So you have to keep track. That's one of the key roles of philosophy in thinking about consciousness, is helping you keep track about what these terms mean. Not everybody means the same thing when they use the same words. Different people mean different things by consciousness. People mean different things by subjectivity. People mean different things by self-consciousness. So be aware when, and you've got these nice boxes of definitions, be aware how people are using the terms when they use those terms. And when you get out after this class and look in the world and people are talking about explanations of consciousness and so forth, be paying attention to how they're using the word consciousness. Do they mean phenomenal consciousness? Do they mean self-consciousness, a higher order sort of consciousness? What is it that's critical to that author in using the word? And what do you think in terms of using the word consciousness? What is consciousness? What is self-consciousness? How do they relate? Some of this came out in discussing machine consciousness in C1 and C2. Think about how that connects with Blanke and Metzinger's distinction between weak first-person, minimal phenomenal self, and a strong first-person perspective. One of the most interesting parts of the Blanke and Metzinger article is their discussion of the ways in which your minimal phenomenal self can be disrupted. They talk about 3 different kinds of disruptions in your whole minimal phenomenal self. That is, those 3 components of self-location, self-identification, and weak first-person perspective. The first one is a autoscopic hallucination, and that's where you see a second own body, your self-location and your point of view stay in your physical body. So that's that first picture on the left side, autoscopic, that your self-location and your point of view stay in your own body, but you see this extra body, a second own body, and you looking at a copy of yourself. And they argue, or the science says that your right occipital, parietal, temporal, so the parietal temporal junction and your right occipital are involved in generating an autoscopic hallucination, where you see your own you see your own body, and your point of view and your self-location stay in your own body. The second type of hallucination, out-of-body hallucination, is the autoscopic hallucination, and that's where you see 2 of your own body, and your self-location and point of view may be at either or both bodies. And this one is puzzling to me. I have trouble imagining being at 2 locations, at having a point of view at 2 locations. Maybe I can see it as shifting back and forth, but I can't imagine that you would have it at both locations at the same time. I can't imagine what that would be. That creates puzzles for me in terms of my sense of the unity of consciousness. So I think, the way I interpret the autoscopic hallucination, it's that your point of view shifts from your own body to your hallucinatory body. And so you might go back and forth in terms of that kind of hallucination. And what generates a autoscopic hallucination is a left temporal parietal stimulation that, in that same sort of junction that we talked about with the out-of-body experiences, and you saw the brain, your temporal parietal is right in here. The third type of out-of-body experience is the classic out-of-body experience, where there's a second own body and your self-location and point of view shift to that hallucinatory body. So you picture yourself, you imagine yourself You feel that yourself, you're experiencing yourself as out of your body, as looking down at your own body, and your point of view and your sense of your location shift to that hallucinatory body. And this is generated by the right temporal parietal junction. So if you get the left side, then you get a hagioscopic hallucination. If you get the right temporal parietal, then you get the classic out-of-body experience. So different kinds of brain stimulation creates these different kinds of body illusions. The out-of-body experience can be induced by coordinating your visual and tactile stimulation. So in the article, they talk about these diagrams that are there on the right side, where you can generate by visual and tactile stimulation if the person is seeing a body and simultaneously feeling a stimulation on their own body and seeing a stimulation on the illusory body, on the visual body, that's the projected body, then they will start to feel their self-location shift to that virtual body. I tried to set up with our fancy Penn State virtual reality equipment, I tried to set up a virtual reality experiment for us to do in previous versions of this class. It never really worked very well. So if anybody has virtual reality experience and you want to try to set up a kind of body illusion, I'd be happy to work with you and we could see if we could come up with something. But my initial attempts to do virtual reality experiments were not good. That's something that maybe in future fancier VR instantiations we'll be able to have that kind of experience. But it's interesting that it can be generated in this way. And so think about which explanation these kinds of generations of body illusions suggest to you in terms of thinking about consciousness. If you can create an illusory body, does that confirm a Mysterian response to the hard problem? Does that confirm a scientist response to the hard problem? Does that confirm an eliminativist response to the hard problem? So think about those three different responses in terms of these body illusions.